Well, everybody, welcome back to a new lore lecture. I'm glad you were all able to make it today. I wish to apologize for this lecture being scheduled so late and for so little people to be able to attend. Unfortunately, I couldn't get consensus, as I already told you in a previous message. I wish I could have done this lecture earlier, but work for university and personal issues basically kept me from being able to schedule this one, so it's a bit later than I had planned. Now, before we begin, I reckon that everybody present knows the rules. Keep your microphone muted during the lecture. In the middle of it, we will have a 10-minute break, in which we can answer some questions if they're really urgent, but I again urge you to keep non-urgent questions until after the lecture, because I know that we have some people that are on a time schedule today, so yeah, it would be appreciated by everyone to be able to speed up with the lecture. So in the break, you can just fill your drinks, go to the toilet, or ask a really urgent question if it is there. Also, I wish to make you guys aware again that this is not a normal lore video. While in previous lectures I was basically able to tell you everything that we know about some periods, that was because we did not know much about that period, and every little shred of information we have could be relevant. Think about the Dawn era, where we don't know much, and basically everything that we know can be extrapolated to something to connect the dots. But we are now entering a period, the second half of the Meretic era, where we have a lot more information, and in future lectures we will have even more information, for example during the first, second and third era. And due to the grand scale of this lecture series on big history, trying to give a large overview of everything that happens, I have to make choices in what I will present. A good example is when I talk about a Dwemer, I really shortly make comments on their speculated religious history and conflict with the other races, but I'll not go into detail in the especially religion of theirs or into the conflicts themselves, as if I did that with everything we would be sitting here for over 7 hours, since there's just way too much ground to cover. So expect this to be a general summary and just focus on the important points. I also assume that all of you were present during the last two lectures, or if you weren't able to be present, then you have watched them on YouTube, as I will base a lot of today's lecture on the information that I gave you in the last one. To recap very shortly, in the last lecture, Meretic Era Part 1, we talked about how the different races ended up on their respective continents, what developments they've made on their respective continents, and a little bit of history on the pre-Tamrielic migration era, when the races were all still confined to their own continents. We talked a little bit about how the races like the Khajiit and Marmor came to be, so the Sea Elves, and talked about the first few transcontinental migrations. First the Marmor from Altmeris to Piendene, and next the dragons from Akavir to Admora, the homeland of the humans. And we talked a bit about the first race that would get extinct, the left-handed elves, or at least the first race that we know of that got extinct. And this is pretty much the point where we left off during the last lecture, just before the different races would go on their own migration waves to Tamriel. Today we'll continue to talk about the Meretic era, and now in part 2, Tamrielic history, in which we will focus more on historical development rather than the technological and evolutional development that we talked about last time. As I said, last time we left off just before the great waves of migration to Tamriel. Every race was still sitting on their own continent, Yokuda on Yokudans on Yokuda, Needs on Admora, Aldmer on Altmeris, and Khajiit and Argonians on Tamriel. These will probably be the races most involved in this lecture, because there are other continents, specifically Akavir with the Sesi and the hypothesized Akaviri humans, and Piendene with the Marmor, and to an extent Yokuda and the Yokudans. But we know very little, well actually next to nothing, about their concrete history during this time of the Meretic era, when the Great Migrations took place, and afterwards. Most of their concrete history shows up post-First Era, because we literally don't know much about them prior to that. Now, something interesting that we will see in this lecture with the Needs and the Aldmer, and later in the First Era with the Redguards, is that their migration to Tamriel usually wasn't in any way voluntary. Each race migrated to Tamriel because their homeland had found some kind of doom, which made their homeland either disappear or maybe uninhabitable. The only original homeland of a race that did not happen to, and who came to Tamriel basically voluntary and for non-homeland related reasons, as far as we know at least, is Akavir. The Akavir races have invaded Tamriel in the past, as we probably all know, but as far as we know, these invasions never happened because their homeland was failing. Their trips to Tamriel were never on a mass migration scale or of a migration nature, it were just military attacks. Now, as most people know, the first race to make a trip to Tamriel on a grand migration scale were the ancestors of the Tamrielic elven races, the Aldmer, with a D, not with a T, because with a T is the high elf that we know from the current games. They came from the ancestral homeland of the elves, which is Aldmeris. There are many theories on whether Aldmeris was real, if it did exist, or if it's just a collection of memories. While that collection of memories thing is a real interesting theory, I think that this is one of those theories in the Elder Scrolls lore that we basically have a lot of, which is overcomplication for no reason. I admit that some of these kind of far-fetched and vague theories on Aldmeris, for example, being a collection of memories and never really existing, and that it were memories from the Dawn era that remained there because the Aldmer were like the offspring of the gods. Those theories have some merit in the lore that we know, but for this lecture I disregard most, if not all of them, as either religion or as non-canon. Because I try to simplify and bring the lore back to what we do know for sure, and the things that are at least logical, and that we connect the dots in a way that makes sense and that is grounded, instead of creating a million of small theories that get ever more elaborate, while there are perfectly reasonable and simple alternative solutions that, to me at least, make a lot more sense in the grand scheme of things. So for this lecture series we will presume that Aldmeris was, or maybe even is, a real place. As I specified in the last lecture, there is merit to assume that Aldmeris was modeled after or built upon, or even was, Old Elnothe, the mythical home of the Elnothe. And it could perhaps be regarded as one of the first places on Nirn to be inhabited, together with Atmora, Tamriel, Yokuda and Akavir, which all had their own races on it. What's interesting about Aldmeris though is that it was probably the most advanced place on Nirn until some strange doom befell it. It is said that it was an endless city built upon itself for many levels, expanded into the beyond of their continent until nothing of nature remained on the continent, just one giant beautiful city. It's said that many of the Aldmer that fled to Tamriel did so because a strange danger lurked in the beyond that would be a doom to Aldmeris for some reason. But what exactly this doom was, nobody ever specified. It's just said that the Aldmer fled their doomed homeland, and it's not really told why. And the only explanations that we do have are out of game, and are really vague and don't tell us much else. After the initial waves of migration from Aldmeris, the majority of Aldmer landed on the islands of Somerset, with their first landing happening on the island of Auridon, which is the smaller of the two main Somerset Isles. Here they started a new civilization after they ridded the island of some fearsome native creatures and pretty much modeled their society on the island after the one they had on Aldmeris, but now on Auridon. And not much later, they expanded their civilization onto the bigger island of Eleanor. Things worked out pretty well for them. They founded the first couple of cities on the Somerset Isles. The first city they founded was Firsthold, meaning it was the first city that we know of that was founded on Tamriel by people not native to Tamriel. Life was pretty good in their civilization, apparently. Due to many fearsome native creatures, it was a dangerous place to live, but the Aldmer held on and built their civilization on the islands, eventually ridding it of most danger and creating an advanced society on the Somerset Isles in these early periods. However, there were several groups of Aldmer that for one reason or another decided to leave the Somerset Isles and search for their luck elsewhere on Tamriel. The first group to leave and settle somewhere else on Tamriel were the group of Aldmer that would later evolve into the Dwemer. We don't know exactly why the Dwemer left the main group of Aldmer on the Somerset Isles, but if I have to guess, it's most likely due to religious differences. While the Aldmer worshipped their ancestors, who they saw as the divines, we know that the Dwemer despised the gods or the divines, and they despised those with divine power as they wanted it for themselves, a predicament which would eventually lead to their rapid technological advancements when they had settled somewhere else in Tamriel. So I suspect that this religious aspect was most likely part of the reason for these Aldmer to break off from the main group in the Somerset Isles and look for a place on Tamriel to mind their own business. They travelled across Tamriel until they came to a volcanic land filled with mountains and ash, and for some reason they decided, yeah, we should settle here, in the mountains and the ash. But they did it, and this group of Aldmer settled into what's now modern day Morrowind. Over time they would build many cities, most, if not all of them, deep underground. Presumably, their underground cities came to be as a sort of shelter for the ash of Red Mountain, but we don't know exactly the motive of why they would build most of their cities underground. And if they built anything above ground, usually there was a bigger underground part. Think for example about Markarth. Later, when other races of elves would settle in different parts of Tamriel, they would call this elven breed that would settle in Morrowind the Dwemer, which translates to the Deep Elves, after they had seen the deep underground cities of them they built. And their land of Morrowind would be called Dwemereth. Whether they themselves as a race accepted and embraced the name Dwemer or Deep Elf, or the name Dwemereth for their country is unknown, but we at least know that it was called that way by the other races. After the Dwemer, many other elves would leave the Somerset Isles to see what they could accomplish on Tamriel. We know that the Dwemer were the first group to leave, and we also know that the last one were the Chimer, or the precursors of the Dunmer. But we don't know quite in what order the elves left Somerset, other than those two. As I said, many other elves would leave the Somerset Isles. Some settled close to the Somerset Isles and some far away. For example, a group of Altmer left the Somerset Isles for Valenwood. They would later evolve into the Bosmer, or the Wood Elves. Other elves would settle further away from the Somerset Isles, like the group of Altmer that settled into Skyrim and would evolve into what we now know as the Falmer. Or Snow Elves, as they want to be called themselves. I'm sorry, yeah. But we usually call them Snow Elves, as that's what they want to be called themselves, or at least the few that remained by this day and age. Other elves that would settle further away were the Dareni clan, who settled in High Rock around the Adamantine Tower on the Isle of Balfira and the surrounding High Rock coasts. In modern-day Cyrodiil, the group of elves that would become the Aeliots settled and began conquering the province. And finally, a group of Altmer would be led by the prophet Veloth to Morrowind, and they would inhabit the overworld of Morrowind and would become the Chimer, while the Dwemer ruled the world below. In almost every corner of Tamriel there were now elves, except in Elsewhere and Blackmarsh, which were still inhabited by their native beastfolk, like the Argonians and the Khajiit and the Lilmoth in Blackmarsh. We know that around this time, the Argonians at least, were the most advanced race that they have been. Not the most advanced race, but they were the most advanced that they have ever been. They had the great Zanmir culture during this time, and they built great pyramids. It is only after the elves started expanding on Tamriel that their culture would decline into what we see now, which is quite curious, and we don't really have an explanation given for it. We know that they were very advanced, but we also know that they declined their culture, and part of it I think has to do with the Hist. But why exactly they suddenly started declining after the elves came, I don't really have a good explanation for it, and the lore, as far as I have been able to find, also does not give a good explanation for it. While I claimed in the previous lectures that the Khajiit most likely stemmed from the common ancestor of the elves, the old Eldnove inhabitants,